Hello everyone! Today's movie is based on the true story of a troubled teenager who starts with petty thefts and minor offenses. But as the story unfolds, he dives deeper into the criminal world. This twisted path eventually lands James, the main character, in a high-security prison. There, he begins a profound transformation, redefining both himself and his view of the world. The movie kicks off with a scene where the protagonist finds himself behind bars. A prison guard firmly presses the teen to the ground with his knee, attempting to intimidate him. However, James stubbornly refuses to answer the guard's questions.
Oh man, this is gonna be fun.
As a result, James gets a couple of hefty whacks with a sturdy baton before joining the rest of the inmates. There, one of the guys tells him that picking a fight right after stepping off the prison bus isn't the best way to start acquainting himself with his fellow cellmates. The name Burns sounds in the cell block, and an officer appears at the cell's entrance. He calls for James and escorts him away. The protagonist heads to the shower, letting the water flow over him for a few minutes, when suddenly, a surge of rage engulfs him. The next scene shows the events that happened 3 years ago. James is brought to a new school by his mom. The boy is tired of being an outcast and thinks he won't fit in again. James wears an ankle monitor designed for tracking the movements of people with a criminal record. The admissions committee is hesitant to accept James into the school because they believe that their school is not the right place for a guy with such a record. Tracy, his mother, attempts to make the case that this is a public school, which means everyone should have the right to attend it.
James already has convictions for robbery, vandalism, and assault.
James found himself in trouble with the law 3 times over the span of 8 years, failing to secure enrollment. James and his mom leave the school. The young man stays in his room, where he writes his thoughts in a notebook while listening to music. Tracy suddenly shows up, taking a seat on the bed beside him in an attempt to comfort James. The guy spends the entire following day lounging in front of the TV on a sofa. In the evening, he goes into the kitchen only to discover they've run out of milk. Initially, he hesitates due to the ankle monitor strapped to his leg, but eventually, he decides to head to the store. There, he meets 2 people, dark-skinned Manny and his friend Crystal. The pair distracts the store clerk, grabs some groceries, and makes a swift exit onto the street. On their way, they slip some stolen items into James's hands. At that very moment, the store clerk emerges from the restroom. Without missing a beat, James slams a carton of milk onto the clerk's head and then dashes off to catch up with his newfound companions. The 3 of them start to bond as they walk a few city blocks together. Out of the blue, James announces that he needs to head home because at 8 p.m., his ankle monitor will activate. He also tells the young delinquents the reason why the authorities are keeping an eye on him. He brought home a gun.
My mom found in my sock drawer and free, so I got 15 months in jail.
Tracy decided to call the police, seemingly to teach her son a lesson. After sharing his side of the story and enduring some teasing from his newfound friends, James attempts to head back home. However, Crystal stops him, offering to meet up the next day, to which James agrees. The next scene takes us to the prison yard. Inmates are strolling about when a newcomer arrives. Guillermo, the local leader, and his gang immediately take notice and ask a newbie to prove his loyalty to them. James steps in, accusing Guillermo of bullying minors. In response, Guillermo tells him to go to hell, and the guards start talking on the radio and getting their weapons ready. Guillermo tries to punch James, but swiftly gets hit by a rubber bullet. The guards then force all the inmates to lie face down on the ground. A prison officer helps Burns up and mentions that he's been incarcerated for just 3 weeks, but has already been in multiple fights. Chris, the newcomer James was protecting, steps in for Burns. The guard taunts James, calling him a failure and warning him that such behavior won't earn him parole. The next flashback takes us back to the protagonist's friends. Together with Manny and Crystal, James pays a visit to his new acquaintance, Mary. Since Mary's place is empty, the teenagers decide to hang out there. Crystal makes her way to the minibar and starts steadily emptying it. As the table becomes littered with stacks of small empty bottles, she decides it's time to dance. She grabs James, who's been her seat for a while, turns on the music, and their dance looks more like a mating ritual. Later, as they walk down the street, James's newfound friends fill him in about Rock, a gangster setting up jobs for them. Afterward, the gang heads back home. In the evening, Tracy discovers a stash of empty liquor bottles hidden in her son's pillowcase. Anxious, she throws them at James, reminding him that at any moment, the parole officer might pay a surprise visit and send him back to prison. James says he doesn't want to return to school. In the 2 months since his release, he's felt continually rejected by society. He's tired of having to beg and humble himself before the system. He then blames his mother for his father abandoning the family. In response, Tracy retreats to her room, leaving James with his younger sister, Holly, who's watching TV. The woman tells him that he's free to make his own choices in life, even if it means letting it all slip away. That very night, the teenager goes to his room and removes the ankle monitor. Back in the prison, James, Guillermo, the newbie Chris, and 3 other inmates are getting cleaned up in the shower. Guillermo strikes up a quiet conversation with his mate, getting a shiv from him, and then stealthily approaches James from behind.
James, watch out!
Chris gives James a last-minute warning, and James knocks the shiv out of Guillermo's hand. A scuffle breaks out, during which the new guy gets stabbed in the stomach. The prison guards are in no rush to break up the fight. They let the inmates tire themselves out for 5 minutes. Only after that did the officers enter the shower room and force everyone to lie face down on the floor. An injured but still alive Chris is taken to a doctor. In the meantime, James is taken for questioning by the head warden. The warden attempts to get James to reveal who had the shiv, emphasizing that Chris is in critical condition after being stabbed twice. It also turns out that this is his first offense, and he's in for car robbery. However, James doesn't budge. He refuses to snitch on Guillermo or his henchmen. The warden then tells James that he is aware of his past. According to the records, the juvenile delinquent managed to get away from the crime scene, but his girlfriend turned him in. If it wasn't for her, he'd be free. Her testimony took up a whopping 12 pages. In response, James tells the warden to go to hell, resulting in his immediate transfer to solitary confinement. While James is serving a penalty for the brawl, another flashback kicks in. James arrives at Rock's place. Outside, a guard pats him down but eventually lets him in. In the room, the gang leader is engrossed in a video game and beckons Crystal over to ask her about the visitor. James states that he wants to earn some cash. Crystal comes down the stairs in her underwear and tells Rock that she barely knows James. Rock tries to shoo the guy away, explaining that he doesn't work with minors. James persists and refuses to leave the room. At this point, Rock grabs a gun and approaches James up close. The teenager reassures Rock that he's not seeking any favors and is willing to do whatever he's asked. Rock decides to test if James can be easily intimidated.
Woof. Woof.
Rock offers him a job as an errand boy, and James readily accepts. James calls his mom and explains he won't be getting back home. Tracy attempts to persuade him to reconsider, but he says goodbye to her, gives his best wishes to Holly, and hangs up. His future partners in crime await him in the distance. The gang heads to the location, with James taking the wheel. Once there, he requests to be taken along for the showdown, but Rock declines. James has to sit in the car with the engine running. Rock mentions that he and his crew will be back in 10 minutes or less. The trio breaks into the house as James watches them. After some time, James spots a shadowy figure approaching the house where his accomplices have gone in. James sneaks inside the building without a sound and heads up to the second floor. There he finds his entire crew on their knees, with 2 armed guys pointing their guns at them. James swiftly grabs a frying pan and takes out one of the intruders, then disarms the other with a quick move. Using this opportunity, Rock gets up and blasts the disarmed guy's leg with his shotgun. James grabs a bag of loot, and the 3 of them make their exit. In the car, Rock says that things just got real for James. The associates drive to a strip club. James gets half of Manny's share for his bravery. Back at Rock's house, Crystal takes a seat beside James and playfully flirts with him. James confesses that he called his mom earlier to let her know he wouldn't be coming back home. Crystal slips an unfamiliar pill into his mouth and plants a passionate kiss on him. While they share this intimate moment, Crystal exchanges glances with Rock, who's engaged in conversation with a provocatively dressed lady nearby. Rock looks back at Crystal. Afterwards, James invites Crystal to join him for a dance, to which she eagerly agrees. As the night progresses, the two end up in bed together, and Crystal lets James stay over at her place, which is on the second floor of Rock's house. The flashback ends, and we return to the prison scene. James is released from solitary confinement and brought back to his cell. During the night, he has a nightmare about the shower room incident. He rises from his bunk, grabs a mirror, and extends it through the cell bars, attempting to strike up a conversation with his neighboring inmate. The man responds dismissively, stating he has no interest in friends who have been jailed recently. James insists he spent 3 years in jail, but gets no response. Out in the yard, his friends tell him that Guillermo is hatching a new revenge plan. James isn't bothered by this. His attention is fixated on his quiet neighbor, a man seated on a bench, engrossed in a book. James wonders why nobody bothers this particular prisoner.
Motherfucker's got status on the yard.
Killed 5 people to land inside and say he's done 2 more since.
As everyone is ushered back inside, James stands behind the guy from the cell next to his. He sees a Rio de Janeiro city guide in the prisoner's hands and teasingly asks if he's thinking about taking a vacation there. The fellow inmate, whose name happens to be Conrad, gruffly tells James not to speak to him. The day after their yard walk, James tries once more to strike up a conversation with Conrad. He knocks on the wall, tossing out a question about Rio, but he doesn't get any reply. As another night rolled by, the prisoners are once again led out for their walk in the yard. James decides to distance himself from his buddies and approaches the silent man. Finally, he opens up, revealing a deep desire to one day visit Rio de Janeiro. James asks him for advice on how to handle Guillermo. Conrad cautions him against getting into a brawl in the yard, as it's a surefire way to remain behind bars indefinitely. The walk is over, and James returns to his cell, where he contemplates picking up paper and pen to write, but his urge to engage in literary pursuits quickly fades. Once again, we're taken back in time. Just a day after the robbery, the gang casually strolls into a small supermarket, causing a bit of chaos. James heads over to purchase a pack of cigarettes, while Crystal discreetly steals a bottle of liquor. When the cashier requests his ID, it becomes evident James doesn't have one. Initially hesitant, she eventually hands him the pack. As the teenager is about to pay, the cashier refuses to accept his money. She mentions how she's heard about his neighborhood exploits and run-ins with gangsters, and she'd rather avoid any trouble. At that moment, Crystal approaches the counter and leads James away. The young thug cruises around town in a classic car with Crystal by his side. He's a real risk taker, swerving into oncoming traffic and blowing through red lights. Initially, Crystal finds it amusing, but she eventually puts her foot down, tells her boyfriend to pull over and scolds him for his recklessness. As it turns out, there are illegal goods stashed in the trunk. If they had caught the attention of the cops, they would have been looking at a 10-year sentence each. But James just grins slyly in response. At night, Rock, James, and a couple of other gangsters hang out at a strip club. The gang leader talks about the criminal talents and loyalty of his new protege, James. Later, James and Rock sit alone at the bar. Rock promises him great success in the future. Rock then congratulates James on his newfound romance with Crystal. He says it's great there are frivolous women out there. Suddenly, James' expression changes as he looks at the dance floor, where he notices Crystal dancing with a stranger. The flashback ends, and James strolls down the prison hallways with the warden by his side. Today, he has a visitor, his mom. Tracy talks to her son, tells him about his sister, and promises him a genuine Christmas celebration. James remains noticeably indifferent, causing his mother's eyes to well up with tears. She confesses her dislike for correctional facilities and shoulders some of the blame for James being there. Once the lights are out, James can't fall asleep. He gets out of his bunk, grabs a pencil and some paper, and begins to write. Even during his next yard walk, he takes along a notebook and a pencil, distancing himself from the rest. One day, James discreetly approaches his neighbor inmate, passing over a handwritten note. The man reads it attentively, then raises an eyebrow, questioning why James cares about his opinion. In response, James inquires if the rumor about the man killing 5 guys is true. The inmate stands and starts talking wistfully about the statue of Jesus Christ in Rio de Janeiro. In the end, he advises James to keep writing, stressing that it doesn't matter how good he is at it. The key is to distance oneself from the surroundings. The teenager follows his advice and spends his nights writing poems about his imprisonment. The following day, the inmates are once again out on a walk. Chris, who has recovered from the stomach wound, shows up at the yard too. He sits quietly against the wall. James decides to approach him. He advises Chris to stand up and not show any weakness. In response, Chris hands him a letter from his girlfriend. In the letter, she reveals her decision to break up with him. James tells Chris that he's going through a similar situation. Chris plans to report the incident in the showers to the administration, bypassing the wardens, hoping it'll make a difference. James convinces him not to do it, suggesting that he should lay low until he gets out soon. James reassures Chris and tells him not to dwell on the breakup.
All right, once you're out of here, you'll get a new girlfriend.
This marks the start of another flashback. In the evening, James meets Manny at a nightclub. Together, they sneak into one of the club's back offices. Inside, they find the owner of the place having a great time. He's taken aback by whoever dared to interrupt his fun and pulls out a revolver. He places his gun right in front of him and states that he'll only work with Rock, not his errand boy. James then aims the gun at him and tells Manny to pick up a second firearm from the table. Rock's protege attempts to persuade the club owner to hand over the cash. In response, he's told that there's no money here. In frustration, James fires a shot at the lamp beside the man. Just then, security guards storm into the room, take away the guy's weapons, and give them a couple of hefty punches. Afterwards, James steps outside and uses a metal pipe to shatter the rear window of a nearby SUV. Inside the vehicle's back seat, he finds a bag with firearms and other items. The protagonist takes the bag and heads over to Crystal's house. She criticizes him for his hasty and aggressive actions, believing he should have left the room when he first saw the revolver. She then labels James as someone who's recklessly toying with danger. The young gangster becomes irate and starts accusing her of being involved with Rock and other guys. Finally, he insults Crystal by calling her promiscuous before storming outside. James gets to the nearest store. There, he's greeted by the sales girl who gave him cigarettes earlier. James rudely orders her to unlock the beer cooler. She silently obeys. After a moment, the guy comes to his senses and apologizes for his outburst. Their evening carries on right there on the store's floor. They sit, leaning against the refrigerators chatting. The girl's name is Sarah. She explains that the store belongs to her dad, and she helps out after school. She has to pull the night shifts because her dad got a taste for the bottle. Then she adds she's scared of James and offers him a smoke. He doesn't turn it down. The girl tosses out a question about Crystal, but James dances around the answer. After that, James makes his way to Rock's place. Rock isn't pleased with his protege's actions and accuses him of messing up a crucial deal with the club owner. In a fit of anger, Rock pushes the guy against the wall, threatening him with a gun. He thinks James acted recklessly. The gang leader also scolds James for stealing a stash of illegal firearms and bringing them home. Rock is furious. He makes James take the stolen stuff and figure out what to do with it before the cops arrest them all.
You and D are gonna figure out a way to fix this.
A new scene begins in the interrogation room. James is asking the head warden to take Chris from the yard until his hearing, which is about to take place. James believes the weak newbie is in danger because of the shower incident. The warden refuses to assign Chris a guard and suggests that James rat out the inmates who might pose a threat to Chris. The teen disagrees and accuses the warden of not doing anything about the situation. The man becomes enraged and refuses to help James in any way. During one of their walks, Guillermo confronts James for meeting the prison administration. He even tries to provoke James into a fight, but James chooses to walk away. The movie then takes us back in time again. Rock's henchman takes James to Crystal's place, but instead of going in, James opts to stop by the store. There, he meets Sarah, and they decide to go for a walk. During their conversation, Sarah opens up about her family, and James appreciates her honesty. He also talks about his troubled past, revealing that he has been arrested several times since he was 6 for various minor misdeeds like fights and breaking things. James confesses that he's tired of being judged and just yearns for a normal life. In a heartfelt moment, James compliments Sarah's beauty, and she invites him over to her place. Together, they enjoy watching TV and sipping on juice in a cozy setting, with Sarah resting her head on James's shoulder while he wraps his arms around her. Meanwhile, Crystal makes out with Rock. The scene shifts back to the prison. Chris sits in front of a panel facing an additional 6-year sentence after his case undergoes review. He's nearly finished his 2-year sentence, but the scuffle in the shower has ruined his chances. We're back to the past again. James waits for his new girlfriend and her friends after school. The guy invites him for a game of basketball. James keeps scoring shot after shot, then comes clean to Sarah about how he perfected his basketball skills during his time in prison. Sarah responds with a friendly peck on the cheek. As their relationship evolves, they find themselves spending increasingly more time together. James makes a commitment to take his sweetheart away from their troubled neighborhood. Sarah is moved by this promise. After another sweet date, James decides to move out of Crystal's place and packs up all of his stuff. It turns out that he hasn't shown up at Rock's for 2 weeks. Crystal is jealous and tells James how last night she had a blast with Rock, but the guy doesn't listen to her and leaves. Outside, he's met by Rock and his accomplice Drew. They tell the guy that they found a buyer for the bag he stole. Now James has to close the deal to make things right. The deal is scheduled for the same day. Rock tries to reproach his protege for his lack of loyalty, but James replies that he owes him nothing. The thug tries to convince the teenager that he will have a great future if he stays in the gang. James decides to pull one last job with Rock. The story continues again in the prison. The inmates are brought out for a morning roll call. Chris throws a noose tied of bedsheets around his neck and steps over the fence. James pushes through the guards and tries to make his way to his pal. No! James shoots an angry glare at Guillermo. The head warden says that it wasn't supposed to happen, but insists that what's done is done. But James charges at his foe, knocking him down and landing a series of punches on his face. He's subsequently placed in solitary confinement. James's cell neighbor witnesses the fight, becomes upset, and walks away. In another flashback, James and Drew wait for the client. A group of tough-looking guys shows up, and after a tense negotiation, a shootout erupts. Amidst the chaos, Drew and his partner manage to regain their stolen goods and flee, just as the police pulls up to the scene. Cops also arrive at Rock's place and detain Rock and Crystal. James sees them as they're being taken into a patrol car. He rushes to Sarah, suggesting they leave town together, but she declines. James admits to her that she's the only reason he wants to turn his life around, then leaves, feeling frustrated. Next, the storyline shifts back to the prison. The head warden is summoned by a review board to discuss James's parole. The board notes that James has been incarcerated for 4 months, and during this time he's been involved in numerous altercations and troublemaking. The head warden anxiously listens to that, but refrains from offering any positive remarks about the teenager. Out in the prison yard, James plays ball with another inmate when they get into a fight. Conrad steps in, warning the aggressive inmate, and even goes as far as threatening him. He then advises James to behave, as his parole hearing is coming soon. However, James responds rudely, questioning why Conrad cares, considering he's serving a life sentence. This response leaves Conrad infuriated. He screams that he would give anything for a shot at a regular life, but eventually releases James. The next scene takes us to the committee hearing. James shares his heartfelt account of the impact Chris's death had on him. He sincerely apologizes and requests an opportunity for redemption. To everyone's surprise, the committee grants him his parole. James changes into ordinary clothes and reunites with his mother and sister. At the same time, we see a flashback of how James was arrested back then. At the police station, he locks eyes with Crystal. After his release, James takes up a nighttime job at a grocery store, mainly tasked with cleaning restrooms as he tries to find his place in society. One fateful night, members of his former gang approach him, luring him back into his previous lifestyle. James succumbs to temptation, and while trying to stash the illegal goods, stumbles upon an empty cigarette pack that Sarah had once given him. He wants to find her, but her father's store is closed. Sarah doesn't live at her place anymore. James finds his former girlfriend's new address and meets her. Sarah is engaged, but is happy to see her old friend. James has no hard feelings. He tells Sarah that he began to write poetry in prison. He then gripes that everything in this town seems intent on pulling him back into a life of crime. Sarah convinces him to recite his poem to her. As the voiceover recites his poetry about the criminal life, James returns the illegal goods to the seller, carries on with his regular job, moves out of his mom's place, and starts a new life. Over time, James saves up enough money to start living in New York City. The epilogue says that James gets his life back on track. He settles in New York and is pursuing higher education. The former gang member is studying writing. The movie is actually inspired by true events. When it came out, James was 25 years old and now he's already 35. He also produced the film. While critics gave it a lukewarm reception, many of them did appreciate the exceptional cast. As always, check out the movie name in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to get even more cool recaps. In the meantime, tell us in the comments, which modern movie gangster do you personally find the most intriguing?